the fifth lesson looks at the achievements of the Weimar period in particular. Now, the first little bit of this lesson is a recap of some of the stuff we've talked about already. Now, let's start with Stresemann's good fortune. Stresemann was the only chancellor for a few months, only chancellor for a few months, but a leading member of every coalition government from 1923 to 1929, and mostly in the position of foreign minister, probably the most important position apart from, let's say, Minister of the Interior or Minister of Economics in each government. Stresemann himself was rather right-wing. There's some debate on whether or not he was committed to democracy, but ultimately, most historians conclude that Stresemann wanted democracy to work. And as such, he worked within the democracy, within the Weimar Republic, which meant that he could gain a wide range of support. So, in other words, he was probably the only person in Germany who could unite the right and left-wing factions. Such was the respect most Germans had for the man himself. He was also helped by the fact that in the 1920s, the rest of Europe is coming out of their post-war depressions and buying German goods again. So if we take a look at the achievements, and we'll just go through it one by one. I'm going to do this on a whistle-stop tour. You can read through this yourself. But the first one, of course, is the economy. We covered this last lesson. There are lots of reasons why the economy was successful. The Dawes Plan had sort of set reparations to a manageable amount for a period of 5 years. German jobs went up, wages for workers increased, reparations were paid, exports increased, etc., etc. Industry achieves the same levels that it had before World War I, and Germany was the second largest economy in the world at this point, industrial economy in the world. So lots of reasons for to be sort of buoyed by the economy at this particular time. The second was politics. Okay, there were no more attempted revolutions, and that's an important point, seeing as the years 1919 to 1923 were so unstable. Parties that supported democracy did better between 1924 and 1929, though again none achieves above 50% support. And parties that had not worked together since the revolutions of 1918 worked together in the years 1924 to 1929. The highlight of all of this was what's known as the Grand Coalition of Hermann Mueller, which has a broad spectrum of interests from across the political spectrum. You've got the Catholic Center Party, you've got the right-wing DDP party working within the coalition, you have the SPD working within that coalition, and that's really considered the best government of this entire time. It won't last very long, but nevertheless, the ability to form a coalition of this magnitude speaks to, in many people's idea, the success of the Weimar Republic. Foreign policy, the Locarno treaties, entering the League of Nations, and signing the Young Plan in 1929 are the highlights of Germany's foreign policy. These are tremendous steps for a country that in 1919 had been effectively excluded from the world in terms of foreign policy. And of course, culture and nightlife boom. Painting, cinema, nightlife, and architecture, much of which I'll talk about in this next variety of slides. During the Kaiserreich, the Second Reich, between 1871 and 1918, there was strict censorship. However, the Weimar Constitution allows for a great deal of freedom of expression, which meant in this era, writers and poets flourished, artists turned their backs on the old style and tried to represent the reality of everyday life, even when this was harsh and shocking. And the movement that developed was called Neue Sachlichkeit, or let's just use the English, New Objectivity. Artists during the Weimar years tried to portray society in an objective way, as they saw it, to not sort of sugarcoat society, make it look better than it is, or to make it look worse than it is. They tried to show society as it was. And two painters associated with this movement of new objectivity were the famous George Grosz and Otto Dix. Grosz produced really powerful paintings during this, such as the Pillars of Society, which is evidence here on the left. This criticized businesses, the church, and the army leaders, and showed them as callous and mindless. And this sort of very real portrayal of German society was something actually that was frowned upon greatly by the right, but was really new in the Weimar years. And we look at this as a remarkable explosion of creativity and a remarkable sort of realism that's portrayed that wasn't being portrayed in many other societies in the world. So a lot of people point to the fact that this happening in Germany says a lot for it. Other paintings that Grosz made show how soldiers had been traumatized by their war experience, and here two soldiers dying and they're drinking while they're haunted by the ghosts of the past. Of course, the ghosts of the people who died in the war that they either knew or witnessed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that sort of sense of, though people on the surface look good, underneath they're broken and torn by, of course, the horrible experiences of the First World War. Um, the second painter is Otto Dix. Dix lived in Dresden, Dusseldorf, and Berlin, and he searched for personalities and things which show the uglier side of human nature. His war experience very much shaped his outlook. It's important to note that both the works of Dix and Gross were seized upon by the Nazis as degenerate works, and eventually many of them were destroyed as a sort of method of purifying the Aryan race and the Aryan culture of Germany. The painting on the right is a typical Dix painting of the horror of war. This is known as Soldiers Advancing Under Gas, and it was painted in 1924. His biggest painting, or his biggest well-known painting, is Big City. The central panel in this painting shows a nightclub with a jazz band playing, fashionable, cultured, middle-class urban people enjoying the sort of wild life of downtown Berlin in 1928. The other two panels, as if to be on the outside looking in, are the revelers on their way home. And as they pass, they're confronted by the horrors or the other side of city life. On the left-hand side, you see disabled war veterans who have lost their legs, begging for money on the streets, of course, because they're no longer able to, A, be in the army, B, the government isn't providing them with a good pension, and C, no longer able to work. On the right-hand side, you see sort of degenerates and beggars hanging on the street, people who are addicted to drugs or just simply unemployed, sort of with their hat in their hand and their head down, begging people for money on their way home. So it very showing that society isn't all that great and perfect. Something that, of course, would not have been tolerated either before or after the Weimar Republic. In cinema, there were some tremendous accomplishments, and many people cite this as a golden age of German cinema. Fritz Lang, probably the best-known director of the time, produced a movie called Metropolis, really a sci-fi adventure that was way ahead of its time in terms of the special effects that it used. Okay, this was the most technologically advanced movie of the 1920s, and it was an incredibly famous film worldwide. You can watch it on YouTube. It's about 2.5 hours long, and it's a silent movie. So in other words, there are captions with music in the background. But if you're interested in 1920s storytelling and in pretty impressive special effects considering the time, you can watch it on YouTube. Marlene Dietrich, pictured here on the right, a German who becomes one of the most popular film stars in the world. She played strong, mysterious, and glamorous women who didn't fit to the traditional norms and conformity that, of course, the sort of the conservative right would have found. Marlene Dietrich herself, the characters she plays are very much empowering for women by the standards of the 1920s, but certainly a huge break from the traditional norms. In architecture, there's a huge movement that evolves known as the Bauhaus movement. It's one of the most profoundly important movements of architecture of the 20th century. The slogan of the Bauhaus school is art and technology, a new unity. It was led by a man named Walter Gropius, and some of his sort of students become famous in their own right, Paul Klee and Vasily Kandinsky. These people create new buildings. These buildings are a merger of form and function. They don't have the traditional stone architecture that was basically common in all major cities in the world, really, up until the Bauhaus movement came along and said, we will use the new technology of steel, of wire, of reinforced rebar to build these buildings that are literally on the cutting edge of technology, that maximize space, that maximize function, that are aesthetically pleasing at the same time. They'll also come up with different ways of designing furniture, as you see from the tables down here on the left, that maximize space, but also maximize the utility for that space. So you see a table that folds out into 4 tables. The Bauhaus exhibition that is first launched in 1928, attracts 1,500 visitors, and the Bauhaus movement becomes incredibly influential worldwide. And many famous architects, actually many of them flee Germany during the Nazi era, go to the United States and Britain, and they build some of our most famous buildings. Nightlife in the Weimar Republic was quite a thing. Berlin became especially famous for its nightlife. The nightclub scene that develops is really, in large part, owing its vibrancy to the newfound freedom guaranteed by the Weimar Constitution. The daring floor shows at the cabarets where women would dance to risque songs, some naked, some not, are really a huge step forward and a step away from traditional conservatism. This stuff was just never done before the war, and certainly not done during the Nazi period to any extent at all. Therefore, this is a massive break. So for Berliners who had been there since before the war, they saw this new nightlife as experimental and shocking and potentially dangerous. Not only that, Berlin, because of the openness, becomes very famous for its transvestite balls, men dressing in women's clothes and vice versa. Sex is discussed openly. Homosexuality, which had been taboo before the war, was, at least in Berlin, considered not frowned upon. And a large gay scene evolves in Berlin for the first time anywhere in German history. So nightlife is a massive component of the sort of the thriving culture of the Weimar years. Theater also emerges. Opera and theater had long been popular in Germany, but in the 1920s, a new style emerged called the opera of the time. This included examples of greater realism. For instance, opera singers singing an aria in the bathtub instead of, sort of the mythological, romantic surroundings of the Italian operas, etc. One of the examples of this was the Salesman of Berlin. In this case, 3 street sweepers sweep away the rubbish of the time while singing opera. The rubbish of the time was, of course, German money, banknotes, marks, of course, made valueless in a sort of a satire of the hyperinflation. A steel helmet representing the war that they're sweeping into the gutter and the memory of the war that they're trying to put behind them, or at least are putting behind them. And lastly, the body of a man who wore it, symbolizing the fact that many of the veterans of the war had been forgotten and overlooked in the society. A German adaptation of the Polish, but originally performed in Russia work, The Good Soldier Schweck. In this, the hero delivers a criticism of Germany while doing the entire show on the toilet, something that would have been entirely unacceptable in any way, shape, and form to do something so crass as to be sitting on a toilet and delivering a theater production. And also a stinging social criticism of Germany while sitting on the toilet. This is just something that isn't done whatsoever. So as we see here, the Weimar culture that evolves is both thriving, but also something that will be seized upon by the opponents of the regime as degenerate, as unworthy, as un-German. And even though the mid 1920s can be seen as a golden year, very much a golden year, the golden years of, let's say, theater, film, cinema, etc. There will be problems that this passes on to the next generation because the Nazis will obviously very much rebel against that. Now, that's really all I have to say. A quick run through. I'll do a little bit more in class. If you have any time, start looking for some examples of this stuff on YouTube. You'll find this quite interesting. Of course, I mentioned Metropolis is easy to find, but look at the Salesman of Berlin. Look at some of the art of Otto Dix, and another good one is Max Beckmann, who I didn't mention. And Vasily Kandinsky is another really good example of a person who was from the Bauhaus school, but also did a lot of art. There's, in fact, if you have some time, there are some great Kandinsky works in the Tate Modern. That is, of course, free to visit if you feel yourself strolling on the South Bank. Maybe one day you're walking along the South Bank with that special someone and you want to impress them. Say, hey, let me tell you about Bauhaus art. Let me take you to the Tate Modern. Beautiful. Then when you're done, you can go up to the top floor and look over the Thames. Lovely. Anyhow, that's all I have to say for today.